All right. So good evening. I'm Anya Grand-Fettermack with the Town's Planning Department, and I'm here with Sharnika Harrell. And tonight we're doing this public information meeting for 307 East Franklin Street. And this is the Sigma 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 sorority, also known as Tri Sigma. And so with that, this is a public information meeting. So this is an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the project, to ask any questions that you might have. So I'm going to kick it over to Amy. She's going to give a presentation about what the project's about, and then Sharnika and I are here to answer any questions. And since we only have two attendees, Amy, once you're done with your presentation, I'm just going to move Arthur and Susan in, and we can make this more of an informal discussion. So with that,
sounds good.
Go for it, Amy.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, so I think you all can see my screen. If not, okay. As Anya said, I'm Amy Hebler. I'm presenting on behalf of Delta Delta LLC. The sole member of Delta Delta LLC is Sigma 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 sorority. Michael Steele and Jenna Martin Pendry are here as well, with me representing Delta Delta LLC. So we're here for 307 East Franklin Street. A little bit of site history. We want to give you all a little bit of a review so you know a little bit about the project, and then welcome any questions that you may have. But the site history is in 1930, the property was developed. In 1972, it was transferred to the Chapel Hill Durham Alumni House Corporation of Sigma Sigma Sigma, who used as a sorority house. Then in 1997, they obtained a special use permit, which is, you can see pictured to the right. That was for the use and development of the property into a sorority house to be able to house up to 45 residents. Then in 2022, that was transferred from that house corporation to Delta Delta LLC. Sigma Sigma sorority, again, is the sole member of Delta Delta LLC. And a little bit about what we're proposing. So the current zoning is R6 residential, with that current use being a fraternity dwelling. It is in the historic district of the Franklin Rosemary Historic District. The Sigma 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 sorority would like to use it for their national headquarters, which is why we're proposing a zoning change to OI3 CVD. That is the Office Institutional 3 district, and that's to accommodate that change in use. So the proposed uses are a fraternity dwelling that will allow the current tenants to complete their lease term. So keep that 45 resident maximum or minimum, or 45 resident maximum so that they can continue that lease. And then a club and potentially a tourist home. That tourist home designation would have a limited use to those that are associated with Sigma 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 sorority. So again, those proposed uses will allow the Sigma 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 sorority to use the property for their national headquarters. And then some lodging, that lodging will be temporary, but that will be for overnight guests of the sorority. Those would be traveling consultants, advisors, those types of individuals. A little bit about the site itself, a couple pictures to show you the front exterior. So the front exterior is on the left with the front left exterior on the right. Then we'll quickly move around to the left rear exterior and the rear exterior. Not going to spend too much time on this, but just so everyone has a 360 view. Here we have the rear exterior and then the right rear exterior. And then we're going to complete this with the right rear, and then you see the right front. So just a little bit 365 of the property and how these are from a few years ago, but how the property currently stands. The proposed modifications, and the reason why we wanted to show you those pictures is because there are no exterior or interior modifications proposed. So there's no proposed modifications in terms of construction. Those proposed changes are in terms of the use. So again, until the current lease is completed or terminated, that property will remain a fraternity dwelling and used for those members and residents. And that will incorporate the sub-terms that were in the prior sub, the 45 residents, for example. Then after that term is over, Sigma 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 will convert it to an office and meeting space for their sorority and national organization. That will include, as we discussed, the on-site lodging, but again, that's temporary and will be limited. Those will be rooms on the second and third floors, totaling about 6 to 9 lodging rooms. Additional considerations. The use is similar to neighboring property, which have similar fraternity and sorority use. Again, there are no exterior or interior modifications, so there's low impact to surrounding areas in terms of construction or other debris. Change in use will better protect and preserve the historic neighborhood, and it will contribute to, or protect the historic nature of the home and contribute to the historic neighborhood. And there will be no additional impact on traffic or congestion because there'll be on-site parking. And the anticipated headquarters staff that will be there are 3 to 5 staff with the visitors. So less than that 45 individuals that was in the prior SUP. So our request that we're submitting to the town is to abandon that 1997 special use permit. Again, some of those terms will be incorporated into the conditional zoning application, to rezone to that OI3 CCD to accommodate the change in use, which again will be that fraternity dwelling club and then potentially the tourist home, which we're exploring on recommendation of the town. So that's a very quick overview, but an overview of the project. It's really based on that change of use.
All right, thanks, Amy. So Arthur and Susan, I'm just gonna move you in. It's gonna look like I'm gonna promote you to panelists. So you'll get some kind of notification, but it's just so if you have questions, we can. It's a small group. We can just discuss. So kind of like I said at the beginning, Susan and Arthur, this is just your chance to ask any questions. You know, Amy and her team can answer what they're proposing to do. And if you have process questions, Sharnika and I are here and we can certainly talk through that.
Hey, I had just one quick question about the current tenants of the house. I wanted to confirm that those tenants are not getting removed early, and this is at the very end of their lease, whenever that is. Is that correct when all of this would be happening?
So Arthur, to answer your question, the reason why we're incorporating the fraternity dwelling in the new proposed zoning and including that 45 resident maximum is so that that lease can continue. So the change of zoning should not affect that lease.
Thank you very much.
When exactly does their current lease end?
So that the terms of the lease are actually between the tenant and the landlord, and I could double check on that. But again, that is in terms of that lease is the terms of that. If you're asking when they would move in, we can give an approximate date, I think, for that. But in terms of the terms of the lease, the landlord and tenant.
So when are you planning to move in as national by SIG?
That I will ask Michael or Jenna. I know there's a few things that they're working on that are up in the air, but if you all have an approximate date or approximate month, year, and feel comfortable sharing, I would go ahead and do that.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon. My name is Jenna Martin Pendry, and I'm the Executive Director of Tri Sigma. And as Amy shared, we are working on a number of details for our relocation to the Chapel Hill area. And so it would not be until at the earliest at the next academic closure of the next academic year.
And that, Susan, too, is again, that lease that's in place won't be affected by this. So if there's any other things, I know that they are in communication with that tenant. So of course that any planned move-in is subject to that lease as well. But they're looking at, getting things together and when that can be moved in.
I understood they had a 10-year lease, and it sounds like you're moving to put them out sooner?
So I understand your concerns, but this zoning change is not intended to force anyone out of the house or of the current lease.
But will it, by being done so early in advance of the termination of the lease?
No, so that's very similar to Arthur's question. Again, the reason why we included the fraternity dwelling as a use and are applying to keep that 45 resident maximum in there is so that it can continue with the change of zoning.
Hmm.
And I can refer to Anya and Sharnika as well. This isn't an instantaneous process. It takes a little bit to get through too. So that's why the application is started early, because it's not, you apply today and you get the zoning change tomorrow.
8
Yeah,
years early. 8 years early?
well, that piece I can't confirm, but I can tell you about the town's process. So the process to do a conditional zoning usually takes about 6 to 18 months. This one might move just a little bit faster because they're not making changes to the exterior of the building. But typically what we'd expect is that for this application to probably go in front of the planning commission and then the town council in the fall, and then they will take action, and then we'll do a final plans application. And so the soonest that we would have all the approvals in place is probably close to what Jenna said, where it would be the end of, it'd be like next spring, so spring 2025-ish, depending on how quickly things move and things get turned around. And then as far as the terms of lease go, that's between the sorority and their current tenant. It's not something that the town's involved in.
Okay. What are the alternative landscaping buffers that are being considered on the east, west, and north sides of the property?
That's a great question. So part of what we would like to do is ask for a modification to those landscaping buffers to keep the current buffers in place. The purpose of the landscaping buffers is to buffer the noise and light, and the current ones in place, there's a wall on one side, there's a hedge on the other side. And so those will serve to fulfill that purpose, and we'll be asking the town for that modification.
Why would it need to be modified if they exist?
So
I'm
just
sorry,
some,
it's a modification. Sorry, go ahead, Anya.
no, you go first and then I'll follow up.
Okay, it's a modification to the new requirements that would be under the OI3 CZD zoning. So the modifications would be to those requirements, not to the current buffers that are in place.
So a lot of times when we do these, we're dealing with much larger projects. It's usually not something as small as a sorority or something that's an existing use. And so, like Amy said, when that SUPU came through, it had one set of buffers, and since then the town has modified its regulations. And so Amy needs some modifications to those landscape regulations to memorialize what exists today. And that's kind of what it comes down to. It's memorializing the existing conditions and what they would propose to use the site for. Because, things have changed in the 20+ years since that SUP went through.
So essentially she's asking to be grandfathered in.
Yes.
Yeah, so, and Susan, just to kind of clarify, there are no external modifications that are planned for the house.
Is it envisioned that, or who will be residing there? Will there be permanent residents at the house when Tri-Sig occupies it? Or will people actually be relocating and living locally and commuting into the office every day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So once it's converted to the new use, which is the national headquarters, then individuals will be coming in and using that as a headquarters. So they won't be residing in the house. The overnight lodging will be for those visitors that are associated with Tri Sigma, like the advisors and those types of individuals.
Thank you. Will you be renting it out to alumna on football weekends?
Actually, that is a great question, and that was raised by the historic board when we went in front of them. It is not anticipated to rent it to any part of the public, and that's why if we apply for a tourist home use, we want to make sure that it is clear that that's limited to those individuals associated with Tri Sigma and Tri Sigma's business.
Because alumna are associated with Tri Sigma.
Well, that's more of a recreational purpose instead of related to the Tri Sigma's business purpose.
Okay. Thank you.
Can you touch back on why this was being done now instead of in the future, like towards the end of the lease that's going on, and if does it matter in time between doing it now and later? I missed that.
Sure. So the process is long, and in order to get everything in place, we wanted to start that application now. As Anya mentioned, it could take up to a year and a half. And so we wanted to make sure that everything was in place so that when Tri Sigma was ready to move into their national headquarters, there wasn't going to be any type of lag time that would be there due to going through this type of a process. And in terms of the timing, Anya, I don't know if there's anything on your all's end that you can add to that as well.
No, I would just say that, typically the process takes about, 6 to 18 months. And so we expect, based on our conversations with Amy and her team, that this fall we would be taking it to Planning Commission and then Town Council for approval of the new conditional zoning district. And then in the late fall, spring, we'd be looking at a final plans application. And so the town could have everything in place as quickly as, next spring, next summer. But when Amy and her team decide to no longer use it as a fraternity or sorority and use it for more of the headquarters and office use, that's up to them.
And Arthur, too, just to kind of clarify and reiterate that the reason why we did include that fraternity dwelling is because there is no intention to use this zoning to force the tenants out. So that's why we wanted to include that and make sure it's up to 45 residents so that the current tenant can continue to use the space as they have used it, if the zoning changes, as they have used it before the zoning changed.
So would you have to make improvements to the property, such as an electric vehicle charging station or the addition of an elevator because you have 3 floors? Considering, now you're changing the property and doing renovations, and I'm just wondering how that applies.
Well, we actually aren't doing any exterior modifications. It's just the change in use. So the use is changing, not the building itself.
Well, I understand your neighbors, Chi Omega, making no exterior changes, but internally they have to put in an elevator because they have 3 floors with their renovation inside.
That's a really good question, Susan. And I think it depends a lot on the building code. And so if these guys come in and need a permit for an interior renovation, and depending on the extent of that renovation, our building code inspectors may require an elevator and other upgrades. But if you're not touching things, usually you don't have to change them in a historic building.
Right, but because their use is still fraternity and they are doing some renovations, or when it turns into office, will it be changed back to office only and not fraternity, which might require an elevator?
So there are no internal renovations that are being changed. Essentially, the bedrooms will be turned into office spaces. So in terms of what Chi Omega is required to do, I'm not sure because I don't know what their plans are, and they might have a different situation with their renovation. But ours is really for that zoning change in use instead of renovation application.
Oh, because it didn't sound that way. It sounded like you're going to be renovating your kitchen area and converting it into executive meeting space. I assume you will have some sort of kitchen, though, to accommodate a cup of coffee and heating lunches. And then your upstairs spaces, it sounds like you're going to be reconfiguring bathrooms to accommodate more suite-like arrangement. From what I was reading, that's what I'm getting from it. So you would have
Yeah, and that's a
ensuite
great,
possibilities. So you are doing some pretty big renovations, I think, inside.
so there are no renovations planned for the upper levels. Potentially in the future, there'll be the removal of a commercial kitchen, but there's currently another kitchenette that's currently in place that they would use for anything like coffee, et cetera. So the only potential future modification that would be interior is removing the appliances that are there for the commercial kitchen.
Electric charging stations. What if land use codes do change, because you're applying essentially 8 years out? What if we have land use codes that change before you guys assume the property again from the current tenants?
So the way that conditional zoning works is that it's an entitlement. And so that means that they, for the most part, they would have to follow the rules and regulations of that entitlement, not necessarily the land use rules. And so like if their entitlement says, they need to provide X number of like let's say that the entitlement says they have to provide one electrical vehicle charging station, and then 10 years down the road when they come in to move in as the office, and now the code says you need to provide 20, we would still fall back on that one because that entitlement is what's locking them in place and what they're required to adhere to. They can always do more, but for the most part, their code requirements are going to be in that conditional zoning entitlement.
So by doing it now, you're locking yourself into what's known today.
Yes. And that's not to say changes can't be made in the future. It's just that the way that the conditional zoning district works is that it's a negotiation with our town council. And so much like I know a lot of the sororities and fraternities have special use permits, which you might be familiar with. It's kind of the same idea that depending on the extent of the changes that you're doing, it might require you to go back to council and amend that conditional zoning district, or it might be something that's small enough that staff could handle administratively. It really just kind of depends on at what time are you doing it and what the code says at that point.
Yeah, I think without clarity on when the current lease is set to expire, we may be dealing awfully early with this process. If it only takes up to 2 years and that lease still has 8 years to run.
Well, just kind of to reiterate what we've been saying is just to get this in place so that when Tri Sigma is ready to move in, they're able to do so. So it's not really in terms of the lease, that again is between the landlord and the tenant, and nothing in this zoning change. And we've talked with the town about this to make sure that, in fact, this lease can continue when the zoning change does happen.
And the landlord is who?
The landlord's the owner, Delta Delta LLC.
And they are represented here today?
That is correct. Delta Delta LLC is the owner of the property, so they had to authorize the change in zoning.
And they are not able to tell us when the lease ends?
That lease actually has a confidentiality provision in it about the terms of that lease, so that is why we are not discussing the specific terms of the lease, and that's between the landlord and the tenant.
Okay, thank you.
Has the current tenants made any notion as to when they're planning on leaving? Or if they're planning on breaking the lease early?
As with anything, the landlord and tenants are always in discussion, so that there's an ongoing discussion about any of the extensions or anything under the lease.
So you just mentioned extensions of the lease. Are you saying that the tenants could extend the lease from where it currently is?
I'm saying that the tenant is familiar with the terms of the lease, and the lease terms have been discussed in terms of this zoning process, because their same concerns have been raised due to whether the change in zoning will affect that lease. And again, it should not affect the lease because we're very intentionally including that fraternity dwelling use and the up to 45 residents, so that they can continue to operate under the lease for however long the lease is in place, as they currently are.
Okay.
Okay, do you guys have any further questions about like the process or, you know, what conditional zoning means or anything like that? Because we'd be happy to answer those questions. Okay, and if you have other questions, we can certainly stay on the call and answer those. But if we've made it through all the questions, then we can probably just end our meeting early.
I don't have anything else.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, so I put the link to the project website that's on the town's website in the chat for you guys. We'll be posting any upcoming meeting dates. So it might be like for a planning commission or town council meeting. Those will also be on the town's calendar page. As we go through different rounds of review with these folks, we'll make sure to add those new submittal materials on that webpage as well. And if you think of anything else, or you have other questions related to the conditional zoning district process, feel free to email me and Sharnika, and we'll work to answer those with you. Amy, Jenna, Michael, anything else you want to add before we close out?
I don't think so. We appreciate your questions and your concerns, and I hope that we answer those to the extent to make you more comfortable with our project, because we're very excited about it and believe that it will better preserve that historic home as well.
All right. Well, thank you all again for hopping on this call, and yeah, have a good evening. And we'll also put a recording of this online if you need to reference back to it, as well as Amy's presentation. So yeah, I guess that is it. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye.